Good morning, Refuge Christian Church. We did it. We made it to the joy part in the series of joy. I didn't think we would ever get here, but here we are. We're ready to wrap up this series. It's time to talk about joy. But first, I just want to do a quick little recap. We started this series on joy, and if you'll remember, it zigged on me when I thought it was going to zag. In fact, I thought that we were going to be talking just about behaviors of joy and how to be joyful as Christians. In fact, I don't know that I warned the band, but I was going to have them at one of the services play most of the time because there's nothing more joyful than listening to praise and worship songs. And instead of joy in the Lord being this balance to fear of the Lord, which is what I initially thought it was going to be, what I realized is that joy is the product of cultivating an authentic relationship with God. And we cultivate that through what I have lovingly labeled as the faith hierarchy. I hope you guys aren't sick of this yet. Now, this feels a little bit like climbing a mountain, each level progressing us and cultivating that relationship. We're going to start at the bottom with the fear of the Lord, which the scriptures tell us is the beginning of wisdom. And then we have salvation, which is that appreciation and understanding of what Christ did for us on the cross, followed by joining a body of believers and engaging in that ecclesia or church, which gives us this beautiful opportunity to engage in the sanctification process, what grows our faith. Oh, look, I managed to summarize the last 5 weeks in a paragraph, so I'm really sorry about that, guys. Anyway, today we're ready for joy. We've done all of the steps, and it's time to talk about joy. But first, I have a fear of heights. Anybody else? Show of hands. Don't be shy here. Who is it? Yeah, healthy fear of heights. You guys are smart. Here's the thing. I discovered this piece of information about myself 2 years ago while I was down in Branson. There's this place called Fritz's Adventure. Anybody been there? Basically, it's this giant climbing experience. There's zip lines. There's 2 different rope courses. It's pretty cool if you like heights, which again, it turns out I do not. I found out I disliked heights when we attempted the first rope course. Now, this course was 3 different stories, each story having a different level. It was pretty high up. Well, what you did for this course is they put you in this complete harness, and the harness has this clip in it that connects to this track. It's solid. You're definitely in there. And so we did this. We get clipped in. And again, I don't know I'm afraid of heights. So I lead my family of 4, and we march up the 3 stories of steps. We get to the top of the rope course, and what I'm supposed to step out on is a very thin rope, 3-corded braided rope. You guys know what I'm talking about? I'm supposed to, 3 stories up, step on this rope. And I said, nope. And I made my family, because you're single file on the track, I made my family march all the way back down to the ground because evidently I am afraid of heights. We did end up doing the course. Now, Abby and I, because we're the smart ones of the bunch, we started on the first level. You should have seen us. It was actually pretty hysterical because we were trying to be each other's hype girls from the landing while we're trying not to panic on the landing because we both apparently were afraid of heights. We were very slow, like inching our way across these bridges that 5-year-olds were skipping across. It was really embarrassing. Meanwhile, our men were living their best lives. They were up on the 3rd floor because they're crazy. What I learned doing the course, they are crazy, is that it's much easier, so the first thing I learned, it's much easier to cross the little obstacle when my eyes were kept forward and I wasn't looking down. Looking down was a clear recipe for disaster. It was much easier to not freak out as long as I kept my eyes ahead to the landing, the safe zone, because I knew it was coming, and as long as I kept my focus on that, I didn't hyperventilate too much. I also gained some confidence watching the other people do the course, even though it was sort of annoying to be told by a 9-year-old to hurry up, it also encouraged me watching other people. Since no one else seemed to be plummeting to their death, it seemed likely that I would also survive the course. And it got a lot easier the longer I was on the course. I began to trust the harness and the track more and more. And I did get up to the 3rd level. I even did the zip line, although I 100% sat down on the platform and scooted my way to the edge. There was no way I was going to just yeet myself off the platform, harness or not. So what does this have to do with joy? Great question. I think we've misunderstood what joy in the Lord means. We think it means that we're always going to be happy, that everything is always going to be wonderful and perfect, and that nothing bad or sad will ever happen to us. I think joy feels a lot like my rope course experience. James 1:2-4 says this: "Count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." The joy that's talked about in the Bible isn't just this happy feeling. It's a lasting peace that comes through the choice that you make to trust that God will fulfill his promises in your life. And we trust he'll fulfill those promises to us in the midst of whatever storm, trial, situation we find ourselves in. James didn't say you'll have joy at the end of your trials. He didn't say on the other side of your terrible circumstance, that's where your joy will be. No, he said, listen, in the midst of whatever trial you're in, choose to find the joy. Choose to trust that God's promises in his word will be fulfilled in your life according to his plan and his timing. Okay, but what does this have to do with my fear of heights and my crazy encounter with the ropes course? We're getting there. But first, we've misdefined joy in the Lord to just mean this happy feeling we get from time to time. We think as long as we're behaving like good Christians that we should just feel happy. That's just what we get, right? After all, joy is a fruit of the Spirit, right? So if we're Christians, shouldn't we just magically have joy? Now, we'll get to the height thing in a minute, but let's talk about joy being a fruit. Notice how Paul says it's a fruit of the Spirit, not a gift of the Spirit. This means that joy isn't something that we're just handed like a present at Christmas. Joy is something that we personally, and the key word here is personally, cultivate in our hearts through transforming our minds with God's word. Did you guys catch that? It grows like fruit. Show of hands here who has a garden. Anybody have a garden? Any gardeners in the room? I am not a gardener. I can only grow flowers, but I do know how it works. Day one, my gardeners, you guys go out and you plant a pepper plant. You come back an hour later. Do you have peppers? No. I don't know why. You have a pepper plant. You have a plant that's capable of producing peppers, but you don't have any peppers. You come back day two. You go out. Can you pick a peck of peppers to pickle? I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. I had to do it. No. You can't pick a peck of peppers, right? There's no peppers because the peppers need time to grow. Joy in the Lord, being able to choose to trust God, takes time. That's why joy is a fruit of the Spirit and not a gift of the Spirit. Now to my height metaphor. The idea of trusting God will seem insanely crazy at times. You may feel like I felt at the third story of the rope course, just a giant nope. And it's especially hard to trust God when you're a new Christian. But just like on the rope course, the longer I was on it, the easier it became to trust the harness and the track. The same is true in our Christian walk. If, and that's a big if here, if you are seeking an authentic relationship with God and not just working through this religious checklist so often we default to doing, if you actually engage in that authentic relationship, the longer you're engaging in these activities, the easier it will be to trust God. And as a believer, when you're plugged into another group of believers like a church and you're close to each other, then you get the benefit of listening to how God showed up in other people's lives. And guys, that's incredibly powerful to hear those testimonies for your faith, especially for a new believer who may not have a lot of their own stories of God showing up. Just like watching the children leap around the course, that instilled confidence in me in the course I was on. Listening to the testimonies of other believers can be a powerful tool to increase your own trust in God. And finally, we have to control what we focus on. Are you focused on your own problems? Are you focused on your own circumstances? Or are we focused on God? When David faced Goliath, he didn't spend time worrying about how big Goliath was or how much armor Goliath had. No, he spent a lot of time talking about how awesome and mighty his God is. And we need to do the same if we want to experience the peace that only comes from choosing to trust God. Just like on the ropes course, when I had a much easier time when I was looking at the landing and not down at the floor. So in the middle of our crisis, it's going to be much easier to experience that joy in the Lord if we keep our eyes on our God. One of the best examples of this in the Bible is Rakshak and Benny, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego for those non-VeggieTale watchers. This story is often used to discuss the integrity and standing firm in your faith, and I can't argue with that usage. That is wonderful. But this, to me, is a great example of the joy in the Lord that I'm talking about. But first, a little background on who these three gentlemen were. King Nebuchadnezzar, he was a Babylonian king. He besieged Jerusalem and took captive many of Israel's fine citizens. Among the captives were 4 men, Daniel and Rakshak and Benny. Now, these 4 men proved themselves to be exceptionally wise, and they found favor with the king Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel was able to interpret one of the king's more troubling dreams, and so the king placed him in this really high position in the whole province of Babylon, and then the king appointed Rakshak and Benny to be Daniel's advisors. And everything was going great until people started peopling, and King Nebuchadnezzar decided to build a huge golden image as a symbol of his power and glory, and he commanded all of his people to bow down and worship this image whenever they heard the sound of his musical herald. Those who did not do so, I'm sure you guys know the story, were thrown into the fiery furnace. So you can imagine that these 3 Hebrew boys who followed the one true God, they refused to worship the golden image. So they were brought before the king. Here's what happened. Daniel 3, starting in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace was overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And those 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like the Son of God's." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. It's a cool story, right? Two things stand out when I think about this in relationship to the issue of joy. Notice how they didn't say that God is going to rescue us from, they didn't just rather say that God's going to rescue us from the furnace. They also said, but even if God chooses not to deliver us, we're still not going to worship your gods. What this says to me is that their commitment to worshiping God was not dependent on their circumstances, but rather a choice that they were willing to make regardless of what situation they found themselves in. That's choosing to trust in God fulfilling his promises. The second thing that I noticed that we don't talk about often when it comes to peace is they had to get in the furnace. They had to get in the furnace. See, I think a lot of the times when we think about trusting God, we believe that that's because God's going to keep us out of the furnace. When we think about God rescuing us, we think about that storm, the story where the disciples were in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. Jesus and the disciples were crossing, and a huge storm comes up. Jesus is snoozing in the bottom of the boat. Meanwhile, the disciples are totally freaking out. They finally wake up Jesus, and what does he do? He calms the storm. And yes, sometimes God will absolutely do that in our lives. We're dealing with a personal storm. We cry out to God, and there are times when God will calm the storm. But then there will be times when God doesn't just immediately remove the situation that you find yourself going through. You'll have to step in the furnace. And true joy in the Lord is choosing to trust that God will fulfill his promises in the middle of that furnace. What does this mean for you in 2023? Well, in order to be able to choose to trust God, you need to go through the faith hierarchy. Using the ropes course as a metaphor here, had I studied the course first, had I understood how the harness worked, maybe even asked some questions about the staff, about the process, maybe tested the track on the ground, I would have been a little bit more comfortable going through the obstacles. This is why we need to have and continue to cultivate that fear in the Lord. Making sure that we're studying who God is and creating that awed respect for him is critical to trusting him. And with the track, once I was hooked in, I couldn't get off the course. But that didn't mean that I was going to go all the way up to the third floor. I could have stayed strapped in to the track at the bottom of the stairs, unwilling to trust the course. The same is true for your faith. We can get saved and still remain the same because we're unwilling to step out and grow our faith. And if we don't do that, we'll not reach our true potential in Christ. We need each other. Just like I had way more confidence in the course watching these small children race around it, so too will becoming a part of a community of believers and sharing testimonies with each other that will help give you confidence in trusting God. And it does take time. The longer I was up on the course, the easier it became to be up there, which is just like the sanctification process. It is a process. It's not a light switch, but commit to it. Work through it, and eventually you'll reach the top level. If you do all of these things, you'll be able to experience the true joy in the Lord because you'll be able to trust him. Will this be easy? No. Will this be fast? No. And will this be perfect? No. You'll have moments and days when your situation will feel completely overwhelming, but come back to this hierarchy and just keep working through it. All of this is a choice. It's hard to trust in God and choose to trust in him. But I can tell you it's even harder when you don't trust in him. So you get to choose your hard. Let's pray.